percentage of the units built with redevelopment funding were affordable to low and very low income households, and what percent are affordable to moderate income households? Do you know that? Jack, perhaps, getting these statements.
Is this on?
Yes.
I don't know the precise percentages. I can say that for the last 15 years or so, there's been a targeting requirement because there was a tendency for some agencies to go to the high end and spend all their money at the high end. And so there has been a requirement that agencies spend their housing fund money in proportion to the community need, which is normally figured out through the RENA process. And so in a particular community, if 50% of the need among very low, low, and moderate was for very low, then they were supposed to be spending 50% of their money on the very low income units. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that 50% of all the units produced with housing fund are therefore these very low income units, because my colleagues can tell you, you can all figure out it takes more assistance in some cases to get to very low, although through the creative kind of packaging that you've heard with tax credits and other sources, sometimes just the right amount of redevelopment money can leverage a lot more other money that you can actually produce very low and extremely low income units as well. So I'm sorry I don't have a specific number, but at least in theory, the amount of money spent is supposed to be in proportion to the needs among very low, low, and moderate.
Thank you. Next question. In the Merritt Crossing project, who does the rent go to? Who is the landlord?
Can you hear me? Is this on? That's a really good question. People wonder about the economics of operating. We talked a little bit about the economics of building, but what are the economics of operating? Well, generally, it operates, you have a revenue and you have expenses, just in a household, like in a household budget. Your revenue comes primarily from residential rent. You may have commercial spaces that also generate rent. But the residential rent, depending on the way the building was structured, is tenant rent, and then you may also have project-based Section 8 vouchers, which comes through a federal HUD program that's administered at the local level. And if you get a contract for project-based Section 8, the voucher is attached to the unit, unlike in, most people are more familiar with the Section 8 program where the voucher is attached to the household, right? So you have a guaranteed voucher payment for that unit. So those are the income, and then the expenses are, you got to keep the lights on and pay the staff, and often you're also supporting permanent finance, permanent debt. So the owner of the all of the income and the expense is, the owner of the property is generally a limited partnership in which the general partner is usually some version of the nonprofit developer, and then you also have a limited partner investor who supplies the tax credits, which is part of this federal program that we're talking about. But so that's kind of the basic. Does that answer your question?
We understand it's very complicated finance. But again, I mean, that was the question.
We're landlords, we collect rent. Tenants pay it, we try to make it as cheap as we possibly can.
And I think also that answered the question that I might have asked, and that was, so you build this building and you have low-income people occupy it, somehow you still have to subsidize the rent.
So the way the rents are set, in the tax credit program, we have to set the rents according to the median income for the county that the project is located in. So roughly, and even we have a goal of trying to serve folks at 30% median, 50% median, and 60% median. So we try to have a range, and that range is roughly from $400 or $500 a month on the 1-bedroom and up to $1,100 a month for a 3-bedroom. And so that's sort of the range of the rents. Most of our tenants pay between $800 and $900 a month for a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom. That's roughly where we try to land. That is set by formula to be 30% of the median income for rent. And then we have vouchers. So a lot of times we work with the local housing authority and they'll give us an allocation of vouchers. And that, in that case, the tenants pay 30% of their income for rent. So we have seniors that we serve, all of them make $12,000 a year. They're living on fixed income and Social Security, and they pay between, well, as low as $0 up to probably $400 a month for a 1-bedroom.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I want to say, I think just it's important to highlight the difference. Generally, nonprofit owners are mission-driven, publicly accountable, whose sole purpose is to charge as little rent as possible and still operate the buildings as a community asset over time. Nonprofit developers also are generally more invested and interested in providing the kind of community building activities and residential supportive services that are really important to building thriving, healthy communities that people can move forward in their lives with. So that's just part of our responsibility as an owner, is to manage the properties well, preserve them as an asset, and to provide supportive services.
Okay, next question has to do with redevelopment. And it says the redevelopment organization had local political tax and CDBG. Pardon? Project area committees. Good, thank you. These committees that were formed were dissolved with the loss of redevelopment dollars. Do they continue to function? Who benefits if they continue, and why? How and why should they continue? Perhaps, what happens to the associated agencies and action committees at the local level now that RDAs are being dissolved?
It's a very interesting question, and of all the thousands of questions we've had, this is the first time I've heard that question. The project area committees, where they were formed, were to advise the redevelopment agencies on their programs, particularly their programs for affordable housing. Since the redevelopment agencies no longer exist, there's nobody for the project area committees to advise. On the other hand, the housing successors will be taking over, that is the city and county government will be taking over some of the affordable housing assets. And so it's conceivable that you can make a legal argument that the project area committee should continue to advise the housing successors on the continuing affordable housing activities. But rather than give you a legalistic answer, I think probably the more practical, common sense answer is that in places where project area committees have thrived and have been an important element of advising local governments, it might make sense for the local government and the project area committee folks to come up with a mechanism so that they can continue to provide advice to the extent that the successor housing agency is going to have resources, like resources that hopefully become available under 654.
Thank you. Next question is, since SB 184 didn't pass and we're stuck with the Palmer decision, are you seeing many cities adopting impact fees for market rate rental housing development?
No, I'm not seeing impact fees called impact fees. I'm seeing community benefit fees being charged. And so,
Also known as public benefit.
yes, my favorite jurisdiction for this is actually Dublin, since they've never had a redevelopment agency. And so they actually do this, and as a result of that, they basically negotiate every one of their community benefit agreements. If you want to build in Dublin, you're going to do something for affordable housing. Whether it's apartments, it doesn't necessarily let you off the hook. And so they will have some negotiations. They've been very cautious. And Jackie can talk a little bit more about Palmer. It's really problematic. I would hope that we take another run at something that looks like SB 184. I have heard that somebody is sponsoring a statewide inclusionary housing ordinance bill this year. I'm sure the home building will kill it, but it is something somebody said is going to come out in this legislative calendar.
Thank you, Jackie. Do you want to comment? Okay. Next question is, please explain how designating proportions of a project to different, quote, renters, unquote, can bring in dollars, in money. For example, veterans, disabled, seniors, youth emerging from foster care. I guess, well, you may know what the question is.
So I think, like I said at the beginning, housing development is an intersection of need and sort of necessity. One of the necessities is putting together all the different possible sources of financing for a project, and through that you can also use that as a tool to meet unmet community needs depending on sort of what the funding sources are. So there have been some small pockets of funding for very targeted specific populations. There's been a federal program called HOPWA, Housing for People with AIDS, that has created a lot of units in our community over the last few years, over the last 20 years probably, and continues to be a source. And so almost all projects at least in Alameda County, have at least a few units designated specifically for people with AIDS. There's also been a program in the last 2 years that was part of at the same time that 1C passed, there was a program that passed that was called the Mental Health Services Act, and that was Prop 63, and that provided capital dollars for housing for people with severe and persistent mental illness. And that source is available for up to 5 units in any project, regardless of type. So we've been able to utilize that funding source and house those folks who have critical housing needs. We're now in our 4th development that's included that MHSA. So I think particularly for very specific populations, occasionally there are either local, state, or federal programs available, and so that sometimes leads to a blending.
All right, thank you. Next question. What determines how long units remain low income?
Well, all of the projects that secure funding from the state, all the projects that get funded from the state or the federal government, and the localities have a regulatory agreement attached to them. So the locality, the state, and the tax credit program all place an agreement on the properties that say you have to maintain your housing as affordable for at least 30 years. In California, to be competitive for financing, you have to commit to 55 years of affordability, pretty much typically. So most of our developments are restricted for 55 years, and most of us are pretty much thinking that's permanent, that we would keep them affordable beyond that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Scott.
For redevelopment assisted projects for rental, it is also a minimum of 55 years. And so the 654 money, we believe strongly would also come with at least a 55-year restriction as well for rental housing.
Okay. Next question is, please describe in quote, what's next? The existence and possibility for combined public-private housing funds such as housing trusts of Santa Clara County. I think other counties have them as well.
Well, I'm the chair of the board of the Housing Trust Fund for Santa Clara County, and I think that the local housing trust funds, you heard Susan mention Berkeley. Berkeley funds its trust largely with public dollars. It's general fund money, it's federal money. The housing trust in Santa Clara is a little bit different. They actually were funded initially with $20 million of public and private investment. So we did a fundraising campaign where we literally raised millions of dollars from the corporations in Santa Clara County. Intel, Applied Materials, Cisco were all significant supporters. And so when I look at the trust, the next wave, I think, for that trust fund, and maybe for some others, is to think about how they function more like this body called the Community Development Finance Institution. There's a lot of groups out there, both in California and nationally, that are private, but they are able to leverage bond dollars, packages of bond dollars, and able to get funding from the Treasury and other locations. So the Housing Trust in Santa Clara just got Community Development Finance Institution certification and is hoping to leverage Treasury dollars to help invest in Santa Clara County. I think San Mateo has a trust. I know San Mateo has a trust. Alameda County has a trust that's publicly funded. And I think the source of funding for those trusts at the public level is likely to be included in ordinance fees. I think that the linkage fees, either commercial linkage or inclusionary ordinance or something coming off of something like a gas tax or a transit tax, could go into something like a housing trust. And I think people are going to start looking a lot more locally on how they generate investment. So,
Just a couple naive ideas about helping to fund on the public side, trust fund organizations. One related directly to redevelopment, which is as the tax increment unwinds, that means that your local city, your local county, various special districts will start to receive property tax dollars that used to go to the redevelopment agency. We all know how severe problems are for our local governments just to pave the streets and do public safety and fire protection. And so I'm not naive enough to think that there would be much of that money that might become available. The fact is, money is going to become available at the local level, a portion of which could be directed by your city councils and your boards of supervisors toward affordable housing. Now, the beauty of redevelopment was it was a long-term system that seemed like it was going to go on forever, whereas your local elected officials get elected every 2 or 4 years, and so you can't necessarily rely that if one city council does devote some money toward this, that they will continue to, but it's at least an idea that you might want to take back and talk to your elected representatives in your community. The other related idea is that Governor Brown, in his budget message last year, said 2 things about redevelopment. One is, let's get rid of it. But the other was, I will personally support and push for putting on a ballot an initiative that would allow local governments to produce a funding stream for things like affordable housing and economic development by only requiring a 55% vote of the people of the community. As you all know now, it takes a 2/3 vote of the community to get a general obligation type commitment. That's Proposition 13. And the governor committed very strongly that he wasn't necessarily against the idea of what redevelopment does. It's just we couldn't afford it in the state anymore because of the other things that were happening. And so let's bring it back to the local level and let local communities decide for themselves if they want to tax themselves to do the kinds of good things that redevelopment and affordable housing did in the past. I've heard lots in the last 13 months. In fact, all I've heard is about getting rid of redevelopment. I've heard nothing more from the governor or anybody else about that idea. And it's perhaps an idea that ought to be mentioned again in the public dialogue.
So I just want to add to that because San Francisco is actually already planning to run a local ballot this year for affordable housing. You know, and it is the place where it is most likely to get passed. I don't know that I can pass something like that in Alameda County right now. The political dynamic is very different, but I think a lot of communities are sort of stepping back and saying, okay, what's next? I think San Francisco will be the test case for that, see if they can pass it and by what margin.
Thank you. I was just going over this yellow sheet that I think all of you got in your packet, and I do see that Bay Area League has a policy in support of establishing a regional trust fund. I think Sally Probst was the one who got our attention on that one. I think there was actually a bill a couple of years ago, but I haven't seen anything recently. But certainly we had good examples locally, both Santa Clara and San Mateo, that we thought was a good model. So anyway, also there was several things we've heard, both the Speaker Pro Tem and Speaker Pro Tem and the fellow who's in charge of the Assembly have both talked about proposing other options, funding and otherwise, to replace the need for economic development, but perhaps more locationally, close to transit and other things, and not using the increment concept, although there have been bills where TIF for TOD, transit impact funding for transit-oriented development, where you would have a development near transit that the increment would go back to that area itself. I think Fiona Vaughn had a bill up on that. So anyway, there are various things. This questioner wants to know what you think about David Rosen's suggestion for getting some or all of the so-called tax subsidies for homeowners to be diverted for affordable housing. Do you see any hope for this?
This was the idea from earlier this morning, if I recall, that what David indicated there's about $10 million a year of assistance, tax assistance basically, for homeowners. And as he pointed out, that $10 million was close to half of last year's entire budget gap. And his suggestion was that if you took half of that $10 million and said we're going to cut in half the tax breaks we give to homeowners, that would produce $5 million more revenue. And if you took half of that revenue to provide other state needs, expand the border, basically, down to 2.5 billion for affordable housing, that would be an interesting way to try to finance a permanent affordable housing source. I had not heard that before. You are probably all tuned as me or more as to the likelihood of that happening, but I thought it was at least an interesting out-of-the-box idea.
I think it's an interesting suggestion. I think it's politically really hard. The suggestion I've heard at the federal level that's a little similar is to take away the deduction for second homes. So that really you don't get free lunch on your second, and then somehow redirecting those dollars to housing. I think that might have a little bit more of a political chance. I don't have two houses, so I think that might actually. Maybe if it's a more narrowly defined thing. You know, the hard part for me about all of this fight for development is that we're fighting against the schools. We have a ton of low-income kids that we house. We care about the schools. They have pitted education against housing, against everything, and it's really not a productive. But we like homeowners. I actually hope that every renter that lives at Eden gets to be one someday. So I think that it's got to have some balance, and I think it's skewed in a direction. So I think if you have more narrowly focused things, it's probably politically more feasible.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's all the questions I have